What does it take to make a way through a situation that looks impossible? As a writer and educator, I want to help explore what it means to reckon with instability and discomfort, to work with the mess and read the big patterns that stay happening, despite the differences playing over the surface. I'm also concerned with interdisciplinary modes of composition, in music and text, the social and private. How is composition embodied and enacted in the work I'm making? Especially when so much of my work critiques the nexus of spectacle, violence, and power. In all of my compositions, poetry, libretti, essays, visual texts, I'm trying to hold contradiction without seeking to resolve it. How do we live in that indeterminate space? If I think back to how I became interested in writing, my household was one in which talk and language and books was really valued. The way that my parents engaged each other was oftentimes through signifying, kind of like teasing or being ironic. My father had this storehouse, this archive of vernacular phrases, riffs off of songs. My mother was just this deft, cutting, wry person as well. And my brother was oftentimes riffing on whatever was happening in terms of popular culture at the time. He was like the guy who really put me in contact with whatever people in the neighborhood were saying and how they were talking. And he's my older brother. And so for me, I just loved soaking in all this language, whether it was from the kinds of music that my dad liked to listen to, which was a lot of music from the Atlantic catalog. My parents listened to Motown. My dad was a real big fan of Atlantic. So like the Drifters and the Coasters. And then just all the stuff he picked up from growing up in Raleigh, North Carolina, and then living in New York. My mother and father met in New York. And so there was just all this language just constantly swirling around. And so an appreciation of that through talk and through books. My mother had tons of books, and my father and my mother read. And so it was just a huge part of the culture of my household. Wanting to be able to engage language at a level where I could play with it and demonstrate a kind of deftness, a kind of, skill, or, it might be a weird word to put it, but a kind of mastery with it was really important to me. From everything from listening to early hip hop as a kid and hearing all of that use of wordplay and rhyme and rhythm, to watching my mother and my aunt BJ playing Scrabble and just murking the table with Scrabble. And like I said, my father's storytelling just really made me want to hold language close. And writing became a way of doing that. And writing also became a way for me to use my imagination and sort of make my imagination into something more material, like I could realize the world and develop the world that I was thinking through or just dreaming about. And so that's a lot of the reason why I started becoming a writer. One of the things that I'm pursuing in my work is how to weave a number of different traditions together to make something that speaks to me. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of times when we encounter something in a practice that is resonant to us, that vibrates for us, it isn't necessarily that we've invented something that hasn't been invented before, that hasn't been made before, but our approach to it creates something that feels idiolectical, and that word just means if a dialect is the way a region speaks, idiolect is how you as an individual speak. right? And so like my work, one of the things that I try to do in my work is think like the producers and beat makers of some of my favorite hip hop songs. So if you think about like late 80s to early to mid 90s, when sampling was sort of at its height, in the sense of people were able to do as much sampling as they really wanted to. And you'd have these dense sort of sample collages for music for people like Public Enemy or De La Soul or Black Sheep. That's kind of where I like to go when I'm thinking about composition in my own poetry. And over the course of my career as a writer and my explorations as a writer, a lot of it has been trying to understand how to not only visually, but syntactically get at those composition strategies, the layering of an audio sample and then a voice speaking over that sample. And so as my work has moved and changed, it's oftentimes been connected to this question about how do I make sampling in a poem feel something like sampling in a song? And at one point I thought, oh, I could just quote the material and quote the material. But then I began to think to myself, well, quotation isn't quite the same thing as sampling. Like if you play somebody singing, if you play like Jennifer Holliday singing, and I am telling you, like if you play her singing that, that's different than what I just did, which is me just singing it over, like singing that. And that's more like quotation, right? Re-singing is like quotation. So if I type out a line from another poem, that's like a cover or a quote or re-singing. That's not exactly sampling. Sampling is taking the actual material and repurposing it. And so a lot of my work has been thinking through how to do that textually. So I'm not just quoting or I'm not just covering, but can materially create the textures of samples inside my own work. And what's been really interesting about that for me, you know, maybe for readers, hopefully for readers too, but for me at least, is that the use of collage and the use of this kind of layering of my own content, my own writing, my own sentences, and sample and collage sources from other places. And in poetry, using that kind of collage work is oftentimes called a cento. That the combination of those things has actually changed the way I will write an original sentence. And by original, I just mean one that isn't collaged. So my syntax, because I'm so used to now taking bits of chunks of phrases and fragments of sentences and then placing them down and having to think about that as like a plastic unit of meaning. Now, when I write just from my own imagination, oftentimes I can write in these same kinds of associative yet fragmented sentences. And not just fragments in the sense of like a piece of an image, but a fragment in the sense of two bits of a sentence that don't seem like they should work together. And yet somehow there's enough of a kind of associative or syntactic magnetism between them that they hold together. And that to me has been really an exciting development, because to use collage to actually change the way I'm thinking from the original part of my creation, then my creativity is pretty remarkable. And so I think that at one level is something that's guided my process, and it's led to using the page as a kind of graphically performative space, so that when you look at one of my poems, you are very much aware that the typography is doing something. And something that I say a lot is, like, anytime you read a poem or a novel or an essay or whatever, if it's been typed, the typography is doing something. It's telling you how to read it. I call mine performative just because when you've got stuff doing this, that all across the page, you're very much aware that you're being told to do something with that text in a way that if it looks more conventionally formatted, you don't even pay attention to the fact that you're like doing a thing. You're just like, oh, I know how to read this. And so I think that those are some of the things that make my work closer to the kinds of things that I'm interested in. Because even when it's not visually doing something at a syntactic level, it's carrying the trace of all of those years trying to think through collage and sampling. Working with visual poems started off for me as a way of turning the page into a stage space. I imagined that the tension or the conflict between the idea of the page and the stage that flares up sometimes in poetry communities, or it persists in poetry communities sometimes, was a thing that I thought, oh, well, if the page itself is a performance space, then I could just sort of rectify that problem for myself. And so therefore the page is the stage and the stage is the page. And so that's how it started for me. I was really interested in how to make that page feel like more than just a score, right? Not just a score, because I do think that at some level, any poem, if it has a line break right here and then you start here, that's telling you how to read it. Read, stop. Read, stop. Doesn't have to do all this stuff. But a kind of sense of space and movement and proximity and composition was something that I thought that the page could bring. As I worked more at that, I began to realize that there was a productive gap between what the page could do and performance could do. And so instead of kind of seeing that as like, therefore one is better than the other, I began to sort of think about, well, how can I work within that gap and figure out new ways to explore the page and how that will impact my performance when I'm live in front of people. And so that's why, in I guess probably about 2018, I'd say, I started working with Photoshop. And this was cued by exposure to the work of Susan Howe. And when I looked at her work in a book called Depths, this was kind of like the missing piece for me. It was closer visually and texturally to the stuff that I'd been thinking about for, at that point about 10 years. Than I had come before. This kind of the texture of sampling, the texture of early Public Enemy or De La Soul production or Mad Lib production, the way it could have fragments and chopped bits off like you see in, say, Jay Dilla's Donuts, that music, that captured it for me in a really beautiful way visually. And what I wanted to do was get a sense of that fragmentation, that sense of that ability to chop letters and to kind of distress the letters or find letters that were from distressed texts, but still have the kind of commitments to dense wordplay or pun and multiple voices that I'd been exploring in my work for years. And so Susan Howe's work kind of created this interesting conversation with like Public Enemy and MF Doom and Prince Paul and Madlib and Jay Dilla. And so that's what led to the work in Photoshop. With the Photoshop poems, there's a part of me that has really worked closely into writing the Photoshop poems, partially because of the challenge of reading them, which is to say that because I don't want to reproduce that reading, I don't want to try to figure out what a font with a little bit of decay around its edges sounds like versus one that's slightly cleaner versus one that's bigger. So I don't read those. And some of that is tied into the question of critiquing spectacle and violence and their intersection. So if spectacle and violence kind of have a crossroads, and I write about that, which is something that, has a long aesthetic tradition, writing about writing songs or poems or, performing dances based upon this idea of violence and entertainment. So that's not an innovation. That's not new ground or a new problematic. But I've begun to feel uncomfortable about being a body in front of a room full of people and kind of doing these performances that are critical of performances, entertainment, and violence. So when it comes to the poems that I call the Photoshop poems, voicing them has been something that has, at some levels, I've deliberately made either difficult or, I don't want to say impossible, but just more trouble than it's worth for me to do. I made a digital album that was based upon a collection, a chapbook of those Photoshop poems called Over Deluxe AF. And the reason I made that album was because the press, Montez Press out of the UK, that published that collection, that chapbook, had a radio station, has a radio station, and they asked me to do a reading from that. And I was like, yeah, that's great, but I don't read those poems. Like, that's great, but we'd really like you to do a reading. I was like, yeah, that'd be wonderful, but I don't read those poems. They said, great, but we have a radio show, so we kind of need you to read those poems. We kind of went back and forth like that. And what I ended up doing was I ended up making these kind of sound collages that worked as a kind of constellation of the sorts of ideas and thoughts that from which those poems spring, right? There's a really excellent version of this kind of thing that was influential for me in writing this, and it's a poet named Harmony Holiday, and for her one of her collections, Negro League Baseball, she has a CD that comes with it, and it does something like this. It's very instructive in this regard. But so that LP for Over Deluxe AF, which was just called Under Over Deluxe AF, has beats that I've made and things like that, but also has these kinds of sonic collages. And when I do have voice in them, they're oftentimes not like reading the poems. They're reading something that's kind of sonically associative with the poems. So when I imagine one day publishing a collection of these and having to do like readings or getting to travel and do readings from them, one of the ways that I've been thinking about how to address that issue of how to present them might be to use like a drum pad, like a digital drum pad, like Push or something like that, and have a bunch of samples routed into my laptop and then just kind of play things live so that it's not my voice up there, but it's, again, this kind of constellation of associative sounds that just sort of bring you into the space of those pieces. It's something that I've been thinking about and something that I've been interested in. And so I've got to keep practicing on that technology, that instrument, just so I can do it competently, probably starting in 2022 to get practicing with it. When doing the Photoshop poems, I try to sort of think about it as if I am digging in the crates, like as if I am a producer or beat maker and just going through the kind of sonic archives that it would take to make a beat that, would be, a new set of sounds composed of old sounds. So the process that I go for sourcing the material for the Photoshop poems is I will oftentimes use Google Books, and I usually set it to the 19th century. Partially, there's two reasons for that. One is really kind of a, legal sort of a thought of like most likely the, copyright is lapsed on that. And so it's, fair use. But the other part about it is much more aesthetic in that what Google Books does is it scans people scan old books for Google Books use. So a lot of times these pages, the printing on them, there's just a slightly rougher look. And sometimes you'll get something from the early 1800s where it's really gnarled, or the print is very small. So when you bump up the size, the resolution really starts to fall apart and just gets this like this kind of crunchiness to the letters, which oftentimes looks really great when it's juxtaposed with other things. So like if you were to imagine a song that uses a sample, you might have a bass line from, let's say, the early 70s. And that's going to be recorded on analog, and that's going to be in a certain kind of room with certain kinds of mixing board, played, in a certain kind of style. And there's going to be a warmth potentially to that you wouldn't get in a digital recording studio, right? And that warmth, isn't necessarily like the best thing you could ever imagine, but it's a character, a quality to that sound. Whereas maybe your drums are from an 80s synth pop hit. Like maybe there's like a riff from like maybe an 80s synth soul or like a boogie song. And so those sounds are going to have a different sort of timbre, a different sort of character to them. When you're making sample-based music, it's not so much that you just want the bass line, right? You want the bass line to have the sound that comes from this 1971 studio from Tennessee that has all these different textures. And you want that texture to be in contrast with this 80s electric drum sample, right? Which is going to have a completely different thing. So you want that collision of textures just as much as you want the notes, because a lot of times you're talking about the music industry. You could find somebody who could play do 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 do, but if it's somebody playing that in 2020 in a new modern studio, it's just not going to sound anything like it did in 1970, 1971. It could even be technically better playing. So we're not even talking about like, well, they played it better back then. It's not just the notes, right? So taking that back to my interest in, say, something from the early 1800s, that crunchy texture on the typeface, it might be a typeface that is still in existence that I could just, use in InDesign. Maybe it's Gaudi or maybe something like that. But Gaudi printed on a sheet of paper in 1833 and then carried through a century and 75 years or so, and then scanned someplace in pretty good resolution and then bumped up. That Gaudi is not the same Gaudi. And so that's something that I'm interested in. So I'll use Google Books. And one of the things that's fun about Google Books that I really like is that I still have to have language in mind. I have to know some of the kinds of phrase that I'm interested in. So I am composing. I'm not just opening up any random Google book and just like leafing page, going, oh, that looks interesting. There was this piece that I was making where I was composing a poem based upon this idea of sort of sonic rhetorical armor, music rhetorical armor. And it was a cuirass, so chest or back armor, built around the concept of a loop, a hip hop loop. And so I knew that I wanted to find some language that would connect with this idea of a kind of spiral. And also the idea of the golden mean. So I knew that doing research on the Nautilus, the mollusk, the Nautilus, would be an interesting place to find some information, language around spirals. So I looked up a 19th century text on the Nautilus, and then I began searching in there. And I thought, okay, well, Nautilus, what if there's something with Nautilus and loop? And it turns out that the way you describe the intestines of a Nautilus are through loops. You call loops. So then, through that set of associations, I began reading up on the Nautilus. And that is where I began to find interesting associations and text. So that's one way you can do it. of course you can just go into Google Books and just be like, I need the phrase, hot pepper. And every book that they've scanned that has hot pepper will come up. But I find it more interesting if I kind of have a sense of the context in which I want that information to come from. For example, there was a poem I wrote called Hurt Me, Please, where I needed something about a headache. I wanted to talk about a headache. And I was trying to remember from Uncle Tom's Cabin if anybody mentioned having a headache. And so I took the Google book and I looked up Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I searched just within Uncle Tom's Cabin for a thing about a headache. And sure enough, there was a whole sentence about a headache that was chiming with what I needed. So in some level, you can just kind of go completely random, but I also really like to kind of think of a context and work from there. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to, hit up Google Image and work from references you might be already familiar with completely. In the same poem, Hurt Me, Please, I knew I wanted there to be someone shouting out, help. And what I had done with this poem, Hurt Me, Please, through a kind of set of associations around the idea of the projection of willful subservience of Black people, like that projection, that racist projection that Black people want to be dominated. I thought of that film that people sometimes think of as a flashpoint or a touchstone of that kind of idea, the film The Help. So it seemed to me that if I wanted to make a reference to someone saying help, but also a reference to that specific kind of contextual help, that using the poster typeface from The Help would be a way of getting at both of them. And that to me is another reason why reading it aloud wouldn't do the job, right? Because it's not just help. It's the type from the poster film, from the film poster, The Help. So it's not the same thing as just reading help. Your mind, if you've seen that poster, might recognize it at some level, even if you don't go, oh, I know that, but it's packed with that imagery as well. And the other way I tend to source material is I will take my own writing from other projects, things that there's opera treatments that I've written that never got used or whatever, and I will do a screen cap of a page from that opera treatment, and then I will cut from there. And I like that because it has this narrative power that is extracted from that treatment that the current piece only can hint at, but it also doesn't allow me to kind of tailor make something to the new piece that's being developed. So it still has that kind of collaged heat, that collaged tension. A lot of this material that I am collaging, most of the time, the text that I'm using isn't just like getting a word that's an article and a conjunction. Like usually it is content that's quite specific, and that's an appropriation. Like I'm not even gonna say that's not. Sampling is an appropriation. And something that I've written about and thought about a lot is the idea of desire and appropriation. Like when you sample something, when you appropriate something, it's because you want something from it. And there's power in that act of appropriation. So I try to be really very rigorous about what happens when I find something that's in a specific context. The moment you remove it from that context, you're decontextualizing it. And then you make a new context, and that's recontextualizing it. But the trace of all of those different moves, all of those extractions, comes with it. Right. So if you remove something from some source and someone traces it back, and I'm not thinking about this in a kind of like they can trace it back and you'll be in trouble, but they can trace it back and find out, well, when you took this from that, it still carries that document with it. So what are you bringing into this new context? Right. Or, if you Are you bringing something heinous, but only because this one sentence is innocuous? Are you bringing this kind of new thing into your new context? And so that's something I think about a lot, when I make this kind of work. And, I think about, what it means to make work that does use these strategies of appropriation, and like, what are the ethics and ethos of that? If there's one thing I want people to understand about my work, it's that a lot of the time I'm interested in the tension between contradictory ideas and holding that tension and allowing that tension to sort of generate a kind of heat, a kind of friction. I want people to understand that reckoning with the work, which I think is different than, say, like figuring it out. Like, it's not like this is a puzzle that this is a test that I'm giving people, and like I'm standing there as a ghostly sort of writerly presence going like, do you got it? Do you have it? Are you smart enough? That's not it. But just the very act of like holding a poem and sometimes having to go like, all right, well, do I have to do this? Do I have to do this? Like the time you spend with the poem, to me, is a way of navigating something that I think of as like the Briar patch, right? How do you make your way through a situation that may feel at some level impassable or impossible or unmaneuverable? Like, what is signal and what is noise in this piece? What happens if what looks like noise is actually all signal? Like, that to me is something that I want people to understand, that the act of engaging it, not the act of like solving it, because it's not like that. I'm hoping that there's pleasure in just the sounds that people encounter, and that if it feels more visual, I hope that there's pleasure in or engagement in just seeing how there's arrangement or seeing the way things have lined up. All of this stuff for me is really quite considered. I revise the way the Photoshop poems fall the same way I revise the poems that I'm writing, that I'm typing out. So I want people to think about that. I want people to recognize that process of engaging the work, that active process, is a part of the poetics themselves. That what I'm trying to do when I'm writing these poems, whether it's through the use of pun or through the use of this layering, is trying to navigate a world in which I'm sussing out what's signal and what's noise. And oftentimes coming to sometimes uneasy realizations that they overlap. And that one person's noise is someone else's signal. And the problems that come when people wish to control what they see as someone else's noise, and they wish to make ordinances that eliminate that noise, because they can't recognize it as a signal. And that, to me, becomes, again, the work of the poem. The poems that I make are not doing that only through just sort of like visually like looking at them or sonically hearing them, but it is one layer in that process. And so if you're looking at that and going like, oh, I'm seeing it, then like, and if you're the type of reader who is sitting there going like, I don't get it, well, then yeah, at that level, you do get it. And so I want people to sort of trust themselves with the work, that it is a mix of tones. It is not a search for a purity of an idea as much of it as it is as an approach towards how to maintain composure when things around you are decomposing, or how to decompose something that has been composited upon you. And that to me becomes a part of the process of it. I am deeply interested in how strategies of aesthetics that have been a part of traditions of the African diaspora can be reperformed and used interdisciplinarily. And so that's at a research level, that's what this work is oftentimes about. I'm oftentimes looking at the way Black folks have made art, have used performance, music, writing, dance and all this to create orders of thought. And I'm interested in those traditions, and I'm interested in those vocabularies and lexicons and gestures and tropes. And I want to engage all of that in the work that I make. And that's a place where I love being, whether it's through the exploration of folk tales, which oftentimes contain like a worldview, almost like a technology for thinking through problem solving or social drama, like whether it's that or whether it's like the most complex in critical theory that you might find among Black thinkers today. All of that stuff is available in the Briar patch of the work that I make. And so that's at a research level, that's what I'm really interested in. I'm always trying to do at least 3 things at one time. And so that to me is what I'm after. And I feel like if I'm doing my work well, and it's always a goal, right? That any one of those 3 things, I'm hopeful that if I'm doing my work well, any one of those 3 things should give a reader something. Like if all you can do is look at this thing and go like, I don't know what the hell this is. Like you should at least be like, what is interesting looking, right? Oh, wow, that's kind of cool. If you don't want to see any of the visual stuff, but you can just pull out the sound, you're like, oh my gosh, well the sounds of that, like that's good. That's good sound, right? If you're not interested in that, but you're like zeroing in on the ideas that are moving through, or the concepts that are moving through, then I want you to be able to go like, oh yeah, well that concept is like really moving. And hopefully none of the other things get in the way. In 2018, I was invited to work on a series of lectures for the Bagley Wright Lecture Series. And so one of my most recent projects has been writing lectures for that series. And for a long time, I just knew what I was going to do. I was going to write lectures based upon these discrete moments in songs. So like, for example, there's a moment in E40 and Keek the Sneak's song, Tell Me When to Go, when E40 says, Ghost Ride the Whip, right? So I was gonna write an entire lecture about Ghost Ride the Whip as a moment in vernacular and therefore folk culture that I just found that sentence, Ghost Ride the Whip, is like an example of a sentence that I wish I had just invented out of like thin air, right? That to say ghost ride, like, so now of course that means to like be riding in a car, jump out of the car, walk next to the car, dance next to the car while it still rides, right? The whip being slang for a car. So ghost ride the whip, like, so doing that. But then to think about using the word the whip, with its associations with the Black presence in this country, and then ghost as a way of thinking about history, and like riders, like the riders, the night riders as a word for the way people describe the Klan, and so like the ghosts being people in white sheets, and then the whip, like it's like that's not necessarily what E40 meant. I doubt that's what he meant, although E40 can do a lot of dense wordplay, right? But in that context, I don't think that's what he meant. Ghost ride the whip means do this with your car. But in that moment, I just saw this beautiful sentence that I was just like, oh. So I was going to write lectures about moments like that, where I would take a song, take a section of the song that was like fewer than 6 seconds, and then write about that in its relationship to black performance culture, and then in a relationship to my poetics. And so that was going to be the project. And I had a bunch of songs lined up. A moment with Casey and JoJo Haley singing a cover of Stevie Wonder's Lately. And that was going to be about competition. I had a moment from Jennifer Holliday singing in Dreamgirls, and I'm Telling You I'm Not Going, when she sings, I'm not waking up tomorrow morning, like this moment she kind of goes, or maybe it's she might be laughing at herself or saying but that was going to be a moment of kind of like self-dramaturgy, right? There's a moment in Digital Underground's Do What You Like when Shock G, who is the lead rapper and main producer of that group, but also played his alter ego Humpty Hump, is moving from doing Humpty Hump's voice, which is kind of like a voice like this, right? He says, he's like in the song, he's, yeah, Cole getting stupid. It's like you hear him doing Humpty's voice, but then he remembers he's supposed to be doing Shock G, so he kind of blurs from Humpty to Shock G. And almost every other interview, music video, there's a super clear division between Shock G and Humpty Hump so that it could credibly say, oh no, they're two different people. But that's a moment where it kind of messes up. So like, I was going to write about that and like corpsing, right? Like breaking character. But as, it got closer to being when the lectures were going to be due, and the call for those lectures was to write about my own poetry and my own process, as well as an interest. What I realized was that I was super happy about writing about the songs and how I felt like they intersected with Black performance culture. But the connection to my own poetry was always going to be like shoehorned after the fact. It was like, I want to write about this. Okay, now let me figure out a way to reverse engineer that into my poetry. So it just wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to be like an accurate sort of thing. And so I didn't want to lie. So at the last sort of second, I changed the project. And I think also having 2 years to work on something just does not suit my procrastination style. So at the last minute, I decided to write a lecture called I Killed, I Died, Self-Destruction, Banter, and the Poetry Reading. And so that piece became an essay, it was I think about 7,300 words. So it ends up being about a 50-minute long lecture. Which, I apologize to all the people who attended when I read it, about the phenomenon at poetry readings where the poet banters with the audience about, well, this poem is about, or I wrote this poem at this point and this, and how that is an inherently self-destructive act. But I juxtapose that with much more overt self-destructive acts that have attended my own poetry readings, say in the last 6 or 7 years, which include everything from sprinting into like concrete walls at the Poetry Center at Tucson, or clipping binder clips to my mouth at a reading in Chicago, or wrestling a bottle of water at Alabama, just like these different sort of things that are happening improvisationally, because at one level there's a desire in me to like take the poetry reading and expose its context as a structure of a sort of mediated relationship between the poet and the audience, as a kind of an exchange, right? That the poet is offering up something and the audience is acting as a kind of a judging critical body, right? And there's this transaction going on. Also, that the poetry reading can become a space in which, instead of feeling like I'm just going there to read the poems that I've already made, and therefore it's like, okay, I'm just presenting this work that I've done, how can I turn the poetry reading into a space where I'm working, right? And not just delivering, but working actively. So how can I take the poetry reading and turn it into the space of composition for a poem? And so if the moments between the poem, two poems being read, begins to resemble, and this sounds so horribly pretentious, but it's the only way I can describe it, the ideational space with which I compose poems at home. So right now, I've got an audience. Somebody in the audience drops a can. Now, I can ignore that, or I can respond to it. And if I respond to it, if I were writing a poem and I wrote something like the can, then I'm going to sonically riff or contextually associate with the can. So if I just say, oh, you dropped your can, at that point, it's like I've started a potential riff. So now I'm going to improvisationally riff off of that can. And it stops becoming about me introducing my next poem because I didn't know someone was going to drop a can. And so the work now becomes about what happens? Like, does something completely unexpected happen that now reminds us, wait a second, this is a poetry reading. What happens in poetry readings? Oh, this doesn't happen in poetry readings. This is something else. Then do I get back to a poem, or does the poetry reading completely derail? So at that point, I have to decide, is the self-destructive activity something physical, something more existential, like don't invite Douglas Kearney to a poetry reading. He might read one poem and then spend 20 minutes talking about cans. So that becomes a kind of work. But that to me is also riffing off of improvisation as a way of Black performance. Like this kind of close listening. It's just that now the audience is a participant in the reading. It's about a sociality, or it's about a communication between the audience, the room, the space. What are the objects in the room? What is the context in the room? And what am I doing in that space? When I think about how my creative practice engages my teaching, and honestly, vice versa, one of the things that I am interested in when I'm working with students, and let's start with my MFA students, because whenever I sit with a classroom full of MFAs, I'm looking at a room full of artists, looking at a room full of writers, practitioners. And so each one of them comes wanting to answer questions about craft, questions about general ideas around poetics, but they also each have their own ideas about how an essay works or how a poem works. And sometimes that idea is, I have no idea how a poem works or how an essay works or how a short story works. So one of the things that I'm really interested in doing, and this is something that I learned when I taught at Cal Arts through studio visits or just sitting with different artists, was a real engagement with listening very closely to what they're pursuing in their work. And then through that act of listening, trying to amplify what their signal is, right? So if you have this idea of signal and noise, a lot of times I think that students imagine that the stuff that they can't quite sift through, if they can't articulate it, I think they think it's noise. And so therefore they just want to go. And my idea oftentimes is like, no, in that part, that's like what you're actually after. So I think that what a lot of students need is someone who can zoom into that part that even they might think is noise and kind of boost the signal and amplify and reflect that back to them. And a lot of times when I'm having a one-on-one consultation with a student, that's what I'm listening for. I'm listening for what they already know about what they're doing, what they want to do, and how to talk about how they are already working at solving it. By giving it back to them in their own language or through the stuff that they're already doing, it makes it clear to them that they might be able to solve it or address it in a way that makes sense to them without suddenly having to take on an entirely new set of ideas or principles. When it comes to working with a larger classroom setting and not just an individual student, the intertextual way that I work when I'm blending these different layers of text and referencing a number of different sort of contexts comes in very handy as well, because so many of the classes that I teach are going to employ multiple media or a lot of different sort of cultural contexts or references. So a lot of the time when I'm teaching, I'm fielding questions from students and having to do a kind of work that allows me to fold their questions back into the conversation as we're having it. So it's kind of processing this in real time. And that takes in the sort of improvisational work of that active listening. And again, looking for signal and looking for noise. It's very like if I have a problem, it's probably, if I have a teaching challenge, it's probably that I'm unwilling to see something as noise for a really long time. Like I will pursue it as signal for a really long time in a discussion. But oftentimes that will reveal, again, connections and ideas that are still perhaps being formed, but can really contribute to the discussion that we're having in a class. So that sense of collaborative learning, that sense where I can come in with the plan or a short lecture or several points that I want to make clear to students. But then after that, so much of it is us making knowledge together. And that becomes this kind of exercise of a student saying something to me and me reframing that and sort of playing it back and sort of hearing a theme and creating these motifs that we build collectively as we move through. And then the associative thinking that carries through so much of my work, which might be realized as a kind of pun, becomes another way of layering knowledge and looking for chime with ideas that students have, the material at hand, and looking for ways to make connections. When I can't find a connection or I feel like a student might be maybe off base, the fact that I've been doing so much active listening and the fact that we create a generous space together for ideas, I think frees students up to not feel as though, oh man, I was off, I was wrong. There's a kind of a way in which we're sort of going like, okay, come on, let's walk with that idea. Like I want to model for students what it is to have an idea, look for a connection, to not insist that a connection is there that isn't, because that's not intellectually honest, right? If there's no connection, there's no connection. But to engage the sense of possibility of a connection, and that kind of intellectual work is exciting, right? And so that even when you don't find one, the more that you know and the more that you can like have a responsible, ethical, grounded, researched set of ideas around, the more you have of that, when you kind of venture out into that feral world of information and attempt to make connections, that becomes an exciting and exhilarating and invigorating process of making and creating knowledge. So as far as what's next, I'm working right now on completing a manuscript called I Imagine I'm in Science Fiction Always. That one is a manuscript that's going to probably be 75, if not more, percent sort of Photoshop poems. So that one's really an exciting project to be working on. I just did a thing where I kind of organized all the stuff that I feel could go into it right now, just to get a kind of a feeling for what's missing. Like if somebody were to ask for it tomorrow, would I be happy? What would I have to do? So I kind of have a sense of what I need to do with that one, but I'm still kind of working through that. I have a few more lectures that I'd like to write for the lecture series that I'm on. And after those are written, there's a very good chance that I'll be able to get those collected and published. I have a manuscript of essays that I've been working on over the past 2 or 3 years that are all kind of connected to giving talks or doing conferences. So they're all kind of craft related. So that's sort of sitting there, and I'm thinking about starting to submit some of those for publication at different places. I also have a start into something that's a bit more closer to personal essays as opposed to the kind of cultural criticism or craft essays, critical essays that I've kind of gotten a good start into. Next May or maybe June, in New York, I will have an opera that I wrote the libretto for. It's composed by George Lewis of the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, and that's going to be coming out. It's called The Comet Popea, and so really excited about that. But just trying to keep myself busy and just keep stuff going.